We actually have a staff of 4 now. So when I first came here, it was just me very much. So it's increased over the years as our workload. What I'm going to do is take you through how we deal with photographing several different types of glass, rather than try to give you a how-to in the short amount of time that we got. It would just be impossible. Hopefully you'll get some ideas how to deal with photographing your work, or at the least be able to have some meaningful discussion or dialogue with someone who may be photographing your work for you. The majority of objects we deal with in the museum are what we call tabletop setups. By that I mean they're small enough that they will actually fit on top of a photo table. There are all different types of photo tables available, even ones that are tabletop photo tables, which you use for smaller objects which will actually sit on top of a photo table. The first two I'm going to show you are what we have in our studio. For many years this was our workhorse. We were in the smaller studio. Unfortunately, this one is currently unavailable due to some manufacturing issues, but it was designed by a photographer, primarily for a photographer working alone or in a very small photo studio. We came to refer to it as a giant erector set because we could configure it in so many different ways, and it also folds up flat and only occupies 3 feet of floor space. Now in 2007 we relocated the photo studio and we added one of these photo tables, which there are several variations of these commercially available. These are what I was referring to earlier as even having them like this, small enough to fit on a tabletop. Now the surface that you see that we use is a white plexiglass or white acrylic, and one side has a P95 finish, which is a very matte finish. It's also available on a P65, which isn't quite as matte. Now obviously the other side is the normal shiny reflective plexi that you would equate with plexiglass. Excuse me. We use a 3/16 inch thickness, but if you're not dealing with really heavy objects, you're probably better off to get an 1/8 for one thing. It's a lot easier to find and it's a heck of a lot less expensive than the 3/16. By heavier objects, I mean anything over 40 pounds. I think I would be tempted to go with the 3/16 if you're going to be doing things like that on a regular basis. Otherwise, the 1/8 should be fine. From time to time, we'll also use background papers, as this image shows, and you can see in this one it's also being used with the shelf setup. These next couple of slides I'm going to show you were actually done many years ago as part of a how-to presentation, trying to demonstrate to people you really didn't need a lot of sophisticated equipment to get good photographs of glass. Sometimes a shelf setup is the only way to show certain things. For instance, the only way to show all of the subtle nuances in this hearts of a piece was actually to put it on a shelf and light the background behind it. Now, as far as lighting goes, we use all hot lights as opposed to strobe or flash. These are a focusing spot lamp with attachments. Now, by a focusing spot lamp, I mean we can either flood or spot the beam of light, and the attachments actually allow us to shape the beam of light. I should mention they also give a very hard, strong shadow type of light, whereas these are soft lights, and as their name implies, they are a soft, relatively shadow-free type of light. We also have these, which we don't use all that much anymore, but for many years they were the only type of soft light that we had, and they're simply called umbrellas. Same soft, relatively shadow-free type of light. One caveat with these, if you use them on a highly reflective surface, be careful of many, many tiny umbrella-shaped reflections. We also use an unpowered light source. These are reflector cards, and we have a dull silver, a shiny silver, one in between that our vendor calls Florentine, and the one on the far right is simply white foam core. Now these are available pretty much from any place that sells show card, or your larger photography supply houses have them as well. Now this isn't lighting, but it's an invaluable tool. It's simply black aluminum foil. One manufacturer markets it under the Cinefoil label, as you see here. And you can see these are just some of the examples that we use to shape different beams of light for different objects, and we also use it to block reflections and so on. And later on in the presentation, I'll show you an image with it being used in several different ways. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about cameras, but you should know that we have followed the evolution of digital cameras from the beginning and have had experience with pretty much every type. If you're in the market for a digital camera, the only way I would recommend going would be a DSLR. I'll let you read the graphic. I hate graphics, but I figured we needed just a couple here. I think the most important thing is the bottom bullet here. They cost much less than before. The first DSLR that we bought was $5,000 without a lens. Today, you can get one with a lens, far superior image quality than what that one was, for less than $600. If you can at all do it, I would recommend going that way. The big push right now is for these ILC cameras, which are interchangeable lens compact cameras. I'd rather spend the extra $100 or so and get a lower end DSLR. I think you're going to be further ahead. The viewfinder is extremely crucial, I think, and being able to focus the lens yourself instead of relying on a push button to do it electronically for you. So, megapixels. More megapixels don't mean sharper images. They mean a larger possible image. The sharpness of the image comes from the quality of the lens. More megapixels means more possible uses. So, resolution, density of pixels. Higher resolution doesn't mean more information. More pixels mean more information. So, getting back to how many megapixels, the rule of thumb, divide by 300 ppi or pixels per inch. So, essentially a 6 megapixel camera creates a 6.5 by 10 inch image at 300 ppi. This is what we want in the museum if someone from the outside is supplying us with images that they want us to publish or that we want to publish. This is what we require as a minimum standard. In the old days when we were all shooting film, we used to say film is cheap. Shooting more exposures was always more efficient and cost effective than having to reshoot something. In the digital age, digital film is cheap too. Capture an image at the largest file size. Yes, it uses more space on a memory card or hard drive, but it's always more efficient and cost effective than having to go back and try to reshoot something, not to mention the safety factor, and in your case, the object may no longer be available to you. Hopefully it won't be sold, so it isn't. You're going to need some kind of a tripod because of the length of exposures you're going to need to have. One possible cheaper alternative is the Gorillapod on the right. They make these now for virtually every format camera. Just be sure and match the right size with the type of camera you're going to be using. They're really cool. You can wrap them around just about anything from a tree branch to a chair leg. They're very solid and sturdy. And a heck of a lot cheaper than buying a tripod and a tripod head. We're going to get into lighting and focus and so on right now. This is the type of lighting I absolutely would encourage you not to use. This is cross lighting. I would much rather see a single light source with the reflector card acting as a fill rather than using two lights. Excuse me. Now, when lighting a photographic glass, we're really dealing with contrast. This example shows a lack of contrast, and here I'll show you the setup. Again, you can see this isn't very sophisticated. You see we have one of those focusing spot lamps pointed at the background behind the tumbler, and it's flooded. However, if we spot that down, you see we're actually popping the engraving more, and we increase the contrast. We've also added one smaller light to the rear, which is just popping the object a little bit and creating the shadow in the foreground. Now, when we're using the photo table, a lot of times that shadow in the foreground can be crucial because it actually helps to ground the object to prevent it from looking like it's actually floating in space. And here you see the setup. Again, not very sophisticated. Be careful with focus. This is where cameras on autofocus are fooled very, very easily with glass. Here you can see just the edge of the rim is in focus, and proper focus and aperture, the whole thing comes into focus. Now, background choices can be extremely important. Here, these Marioni pieces were shot on the photo table with a combination of front and back light, and here on a black background. Now, absolutely nothing has changed lighting-wise on these with the exception of the backlight going away, because obviously on the black background we don't need it. So we carefully measured the position of these on the photo table, removed them, put down the black background, placed them in the exact same position, did not adjust the lighting at all. So you can see what a difference the background can make. A word about black backgrounds. The truest, blackest black that we have found is a black velvet, and velvets are available in many, many different blends. And what we have found works best is a rayon acetate blend. And even when we're using a black velvet background, we usually put it down over something dark, just to make sure there isn't any possible show through. Now, once in a while, we'll also use a piece of black plate glass or black plexiglass, as this example shows. While this isn't glass, we actually shot this to illustrate foot candles, which is a way of measuring light levels. And here you can see the setup. You see here we're actually putting light right through a piece of that white acrylic that we use on the photo table. And what that's doing is actually creating this halo or light background around the object. Now, pretty much the same setup can be used for things like this, with the exception is that light going through the acrylic has been flooded for this image rather than spotted down, so we get a broader background light. Now, we like to keep things as simple as we can, so from time to time we'll use our copy stand as a macro stage, and here you can see we're actually using the lights that come with it. We've diffused them a bit with some drafting film. The one thing I would like to point out in this shot is, if you'll notice, the background here is actually 10 to 12 inches underneath that glass shell. The reason being, if at all possible, especially with smaller objects like this, if you can separate them from the background, you get a tremendous amount of definition that you don't get otherwise, and it really, really makes them jump. And here in the final shot, it was kind of a fun shot to do because when we went to place the last 2 or 3 beads, they rolled and knocked the rest of them out of position, so we had to start over. We use the same setup with different types of lighting. Again, it works very well for beads, appliques, what have you. Here, we've simply put a black background down. Now, the next image, I'm sorry. Remember the photo table? That plexi we talked about, it's also available in a black P95 finish, and you can get results like this and this. It's an interesting surface to work with. It doesn't react or behave at all like you think it would when you put a light on it, so it really takes a lot of playing around with your lighting and experimentation, but when you can make it works very, very well. Now, the next couple of images I'm going to show you illustrate one light setups using these reflector cards for fill, almost giving the impression of an internal light or glow within the object. Now, both of these use the soft light overhead, slightly to the rear, and we've cut a piece of that reflector card. In both cases, it was the dull silver, small enough to fit behind the object, and angled just right to reflect the amount of light from the soft light that we had above them, to transmit the amount of light through the object that we wanted to give it that little bit of glow. Now, a word about reflections. It's glass. You're not going to defeat the laws of physics. You put a hard light on a curved, shiny, reflective surface, you're going to have a reflection somewhere. Yeah, I know we've got Photoshop we can get rid of. We don't like to do that. We'd rather have you do the lighting first. Learn to control your reflections. I love to use this as an example of reflections actually being a useful tool. Now, the whole cover on this goblet and the finial are totally gone without what they are reflecting. Now, I'm going to walk you through the setup on this, and the next image I'm going to show you will actually show you that setup, but I have to tell you, I had to do details of the engraving all around the goblet, and as you can see, the cover actually intrudes into some of that script. So I removed the cover, and when I was finished shooting all of the details, I had my little aha moment and said this would be a great setup shot, but I neglected to put the cover back on the goblet. But nothing has changed except the cover is not on the goblet. Now just to walk you through, we have a main light here, which is transmitting through that acrylic, and if I can back up, what that's doing is giving us the sharp fall off back here, letting the upper part of the background go black. It's lighting the foot, the stem, and actually the engraving of the goblet as well. But at this point, that cover is totally gone. So what we've done is put reflector cards up here, and they are reflecting from this light coming through the table, bringing out finial here, part of the top, and then we've added a couple more back here, down lower, and these even lower. And what these are doing are giving us the shoulder of the cover and also just a little bit of the edge of the bowl of the goblet that we were losing otherwise. But I just love to use this as an example as how reflections can be a very, very useful tool for you to learn how to use. Don't be scared of them. Now, when we shoot stained glass, we always use some front light in conjunction with light transmitting through it to help show not so much the leading as the different details in the glass. For example, the little opalescent jewels in this Louis Sullivan window, without some front light along with the back light, you wouldn't really convey the true nature of that opalescence. As with everything, there are exceptions. Sometimes we do have the light to show the leading. With iridescent objects or ones with foil enclosures, gilding, or silver or gold mounts, we use a tinting setup. The only way to accurately show the true color of objects like this is by what they reflect. And 99.9% of the time, that's something white. There are many commercially available tinting setups, or they can be easily fabricated. This shows the first tinting setup we ever used, actually, many years ago, which was simply a bed sheet, which we folded over the photo table and went through it. It doesn't have to be fancy. It costs a lot of money. Just use your imagination. This is a different type of tinting setup, or a modified tinting setup is what I like to refer to it as. It's simply two pieces of foam core that we have seamed at the top to form this A shape. In this particular instance, it was used to bring out the detail of the engraving on the cover of this object. The same type of A shape, if you will, was used for this ewer. The surface of this is absolutely crazy. No matter what kind of light you put on it, it goes absolutely nuts with reflection. So the only way to light this was using that A frame, which is reflecting the light from the photo table back onto the object, which is providing the majority of the light. Now, we're also supplementing that a bit with a couple of soft lights, just kissing the front edge of that A without shining directly onto the object, which is helping to fill it just a little bit more. Sometimes white paper works just as well as anything. And here, the final image. Just a few more examples of different modified tinting setups that we have used. Here, the gilding on the green chandelier, and here the setup, which also gives you an idea of why we had to move the studio to a larger space. Here, this Lobmeyer vase, and the setup. Again, all of the white is bringing out the gilding on it. This cut glass lamp, I wanted to photograph on a black background because I thought cut glass would look very, very nice. However, the silver arms would have disappeared totally. So the solution, again, the white foam core reflecting onto it. The same principle can be used for overhead setups here with this Tiffany plat. And a little bit different here, you can see the piece of white foam core that we have at the top. We actually have a hole cut in this that we're putting the camera lens down through. And what we've got are 4 soft lights shining up at that card without hitting the lens of the camera, because we don't want any flare. And they are reflecting that matte reflection back down onto the iridescence on the Tiffany plaque. And there was another card right here in the front too, but we removed that in order to show the setup. This is an interesting situation I ran into a couple of years ago, which I hadn't encountered before. I thought it might be worth mentioning. This is a Howard Bentrey drawing, and he used metallic ink or paint to do the drawing, and it's about 30 by 40 inches. And how I dealt with it was treat it as one would treat a normal reflective piece of flat artwork, which was 2 lights, 1 on each side at 45-degree angles, which that lit the whole thing evenly. However, all of the painting went totally black. You couldn't see any of the color in it whatsoever. So the solution, again, take a 4x8 sheet of foam core, cut a hole for the lens, and then lit the front of that with a soft light, which in turn that reflected from the foam core back onto the ink and actually brings out the colors so you can actually see the colors of the drawing. Mirror black is a similar situation. You pretty much see it by what it reflects. And again, white usually works best here with the octopus chandelier and the setup. And again, you see why we needed to move the photo studio. Here we have the added benefit of silver along with the mirror black, and it really shows you how well that tinting type setup can work because you don't have any real obnoxious reflections going on. With these mirror black candlesticks, rather than do a full tinting setup, I wanted to let some of the really dark color of the mirror black to show through because I felt it helped show the contours of the candlesticks. Now, mirrors themselves are pretty much the same story. They have a little bit more leeway in that you can let them reflect another color rather than white if you prefer. I'm sure you've all seen catalog images of mirrors reflecting grays or blues or what have you. In this example, is the Bluebird radio. The blue actually will not show up as blue unless it's reflecting something white. Now this is on display up in the Modern Gallery. If you get a chance, just walk around in front of it. You'll have a better feel for what I'm talking about it, because you'll see where it's reflecting something light and where it's not, how the blue will disappear. Now, as you're probably aware, we use lighting to create, transitional from light to dark backgrounds for contrast. Here, light to dark to punch the engraving. Same story for the cutting on this bowl. Here to show the opalescent neck and contrast between the colors of the object. And here we've gone, darker at the bottom, lighter at the top to show the cutting detail. Now this is a more extreme example to show the contrast of the clarity of the bowl compared to the goblet and the rest of the object. Now the backlight here is actually one of our spot lamps lighting the front or top surface of the photo table or that white acrylic rather than transmitting through it, yet it gives you the same feel as being transmitted through it. And you can do pretty much the same thing with a white background paper. Now, these two images of this object compare without much of a transition and a sharp one for detail. One on the left was actually what was requested by the curator. That's how he wanted it lit. We knew we weren't going to be happy with it, so we went ahead and shot it the way that we normally would on the right. I'll leave it to your imagination which image gets used all of the time. One thing this really points out is you have to be careful with what you're asking for. You really have to communicate if someone else is photographing your work for you. Because if you don't ask for the right thing, you might actually get what you are asking for and not be happy. So, what's right? It's up to you to decide. This is the same parts of a piece with different lighting or angle or both. They all work. Which works best is which works best for you. You'll have to decide that. Interestingly, last year I had Yurji Hartzabe in 2 of these presentations. I put him on the spot the first week and asked him to pick which image he preferred, and he picked one. So when he showed up the second week, I thought, well, I'm going to try it again. And sure enough, he picked a different one. So obviously it depends on your mood at the time too. Same situation, cut glass plate on a light background, dark background, different angle. They all work, they're just different. Here's an example of 2 views actually working, but unfortunately for us, this first view, which we really knocked ourselves out on trying to make this work on a black background, we were very proud of it, only to find out later, and mind you, we researched it first, that it was in the wrong orientation, which obviously ruled out using the black background at that point. But again, it stresses that communication issue. You really have to communicate. If you want to show details of your work, perhaps illustrating technique like this, it's absolutely essential that you have a macro lens. If you're dealing with a full-frame DSLR, I should mention DSLRs are available in DX and FX formats. FX is a full-frame 35 millimeter. DX is about 70%. DX is going to be fine for most of your purposes. But with an FX format or 35 millimeter format, I would recommend a macro lens with a focal length of about 105 millimeters. It will give you a great enough working distance so that you're not going to be right on top of the object or possibly blocking your lighting. For years, the only macro lenses that were available were the 55 to 60 millimeter focal length. And when I would have to do real tight details on objects, I would actually have to relight the object because I would be so close I would be blocking my lighting. So it was a real good thing for us when we came out with the longer focal length macro lenses. Now this is that setup I was telling you about earlier, showing several pieces of that Cinefoil in use. So there we go. Here you see we actually have it covering the soft light. We've cut a circle out. And what this is doing is actually creating a soft spotlight, if you will. And these soft lights back here, you see we've knocked off probably 1/3 to 2/3 of the light coming from them. And down here on the table, we're actually using some of that Cinefoil to block some of the reflections that we're getting from these lights. And here, the final image. Now this setup shows using a black card to eliminate veiling or mirroring of our camera, us, and the environment from the highly reflective surface of this object. If we move behind the object and look back towards the camera, you can see, again, we're shooting through a piece of black film core this time, a hole just large enough for the lens, and that's giving the front reflective surface of the object just that blackness to reflect, which is nothingness, so everything disappears. As you can see from the back side of the object, the front side is equally as reflective as that is. You can see everything that's mirroring that. And the final image. Now the image of this plaque illustrates pretty much the same principle, except we're using an overhead plate glass setup. Here you can see we've got the plaque on a glass shelf. In this instance, however, we're using black background paper to create that blackness to reflect into the glass shelf, giving it that nothingness. And if you'll notice, we also have a piece of reflector card underneath the shelf on top of the velvet. And we're lighting that separately from this light back here, and there's the Cinefoil there blocking any reflection from that light hitting the plate. And by angling this, we can, again, transmit just the right amount of light that we want through that plaque. Again, let me take you back to that copy stand setup with all of the beads, separating them from the background. Same principle here on a larger scale. Pretty much the same setup for this cameo plaque. Now, using a white background under a shelf like that and lighting the white background independently of any object gives that same amount of separation and dimension to the object. To depending upon the object, sometimes it's possible to do 3/4 angle shots in the same way. This is the setup that we use, and here you can see the final image. To compare the effect that you get with this, using this method versus regular tabletop method, here's an image of shallow bowl, which is only part of an object, and when we assemble the whole object, we can't do it that way any longer. And you see, in this instance, some of that cutting actually suffers a bit, but when you have mixed materials like this, it's always going to be a compromise. You can make one look great, the other don't look lousy, so you have to compromise to make both of them look as good as they possibly can. Now, sometimes lighting setups can look very, very complicated, as with this Tiffany face. Doesn't matter. What really matters is what the final image looks like. I have to say that there's no Photoshop wizardry going on here. This was shot on film, and as was the final image. The only Photoshop going on was after the image was scanned. You have to be very careful with what you're doing, how you're framing objects. I really believe the less Photoshop work you have to do, the better off you're going to be. I think you really need to concentrate on lighting and lighting properly. It's going to save a lot of headaches in the long run, I think. Now, just for a few oddballs or exceptions, this object is on display up in the Hyman Gallery. When we were setting it up in the photo studio, we had the overhead fluorescent lights on, and we kind of liked the cleanness of the way it looked that way. So we decided, what the heck, let's give it a shot and see what we can do with it. So the only thing other than the fluorescent overheads that we did was take some of that white foam core and just used it to open up the shadows a little bit, just reflecting from those overhead lights. And we had to get a new color profile for our digital back for the fluorescents, but other than that, nothing was done. This large micro mosaic needed to be photographed for publication long before it was going to be installed. It literally weighs a ton, so it couldn't be removed from its crate at the time at the Fine Arts Warehouse where it was being stored. So we had to photograph it there in the crate. And again, it points out it's the final image that matters, not how you got to it. This paperweight was a real challenge. While it actually looks like this when you're holding it in your hand, as soon as you put any kind of light on it, you start to project a striated pattern onto that red ground. And this thing drove me nuts for a few days. The final solution was actually submerging it underwater. What the water did was actually create a new lens for that. And then again, this was shot on film, and our old photo studio was located right next to a loading dock area, so it was kind of dusty. And we did a lot of exposures. They were long exposures. So this is actually setting in a black Corningware bowl filled with water, which in turn is setting in a larger black dish, because between each exposure we would have to overflow the dish with the paperweight so that we would get rid of the thin layer of dust that formed on the surface of the water. It took a long time to do the exposures for this. And I like to use this to point out, I really don't miss film all that much now. Because digitally we can do this one shot and be done with it. That pretty much ends the formal presentation. I have 4 or 5 slides of our current photo studio. If you have any interest in seeing them, I'm happy to show you. Otherwise, questions, whatever. So,
love to see it.
Want to see them? Okay. This is when we were moving in 2007, actually, and this demonstrates that we have 2 full setups going simultaneously. This is what I refer to as my side most of the time, and we use this primarily for the transmitted light setup. And if we move to the other side, we use that with the black backgrounds most of the time. And as you can see, we also put down some flooring over here against this white wall, and we use that to simulate a gallery setting for larger objects that won't fit on the photo table. If you look through the Heinemann catalog at all, you'll see all of the larger objects that are photographed around that flooring. You'll recognize now how it was done. And again, copy stand. And if we move outside of the studio, you can see these are our workstations where all of the post-capture work is done on our images. And that's it. So, questions? Thank you.
How much Photoshop, or what do you do? Do you, like, if you do any Photoshop for it?
Everything has some Photoshop. Those sharp transitional backgrounds that we do, they're trouble digitally. There's no way around that. So we actually have to do a path for the object and then create a background that simulates the way it was actually photographed and drop that in. Because otherwise you get colored banding where that transition happens. It's virtually impossible here.